Welcome to the course Culturally Responsive Built Environments. Today we are going to talk about understanding construction workers' housing. In fact, in all our course we did talk about various types of shelter, the provision of shelter, starting from a small dwelling to a very big plazas and even much more bigger towns. But we haven't thought about who provides all these things for us, who builds this. So these are the construction workers. In fact, if you look at the industry as a construction as an industry, it talks about 7.74% of the GDP in the year 2016-17. And this is the fifth largest employer in the public sector and eighth largest in the private sector. So you can see here about the informal workforce, 94.7% of workers in informal employment in urban India. In fact, so this is a brief statistics about what is the kind of informal sector working in these kind of activities. And it is not only about construction activities, people working on urban sanitations, people working on some operations and maintenance. So there's a huge segment. Construction is one of the important segments. That is where we can see the physically woven city and the newly built clusters, demolitions and new additions into it. But who are making it for us? But where do they live? The way they are making us a nice houses, but if you look at the way they live and the kind of dynamics of their housing patterns, it is really shocking. So what you can see is here kind of construction workers housing near the project sites. Some of them are with a where you get the shuttering sheets, they're made with the shuttering sheets. Some of them you get most of the tin sheds, completely like a kind of slum, and some even with the kind of very temporary structures. And in few places you can find with the brick so that it could be reused again further. So these are the variety of shelters which you will find. But if you look at the kind of duration, that is again a kind of temporal framework, because it depends on who they are, for what purpose they are, what is the skilled labor, unskilled labor, what time they are going to be in this project. So everything has, so how one can understand this whole dynamic situation. And this is where one of my student, Venkatesh Arunachalam, he developed his master's dissertation on design strategies for construction workers' housing. So this is just recently completed thesis, and why I'm showing this is, at least this can give a better idea on a kind of methodology on how he has implemented to understand the construction workers' housing and its dynamics, and what are the various the potential actors who play in it, and as well as various external and internal influences, how it shapes the dynamic environment. So it not only provides a way to look into it, it also provides various introduction to various dimensions. One, how it's not just only the architectural dimension which have a control of it, but there is much beyond it. So that is where Venkatesh looks into it, and how he collates all the information and how he triangulates with one another, and how he develops the design strategies. But still, instead of showing X, Y, Z, I just want to introduce my own student's work, where he developed a very intensive study, especially in an Indian context. So the first stage is how we can understand the construction workers. In fact, there are a lot of missions I would like to bring to your notice. The Housing for All mission, by 2022, they want to cover a vast number of housing projects, and the demand is also that 20 million houses are needed. And again, the affordable housing projects which are in partnership. So on one hand, there has a demand on the housing, and especially the lower income group, the EWS, and the Ministry of Rural Development, Ministry of Urban Development, all of them are cooperating and coordinating with various projects. But the other side, if you see, there are many aspects how these projects also fail to accommodate the construction workers, whether in terms of gender, whether in terms of their the financial aspect of it, whether they have the health aspect of it. So there are various blocks which can talk about how they fail, and especially the safety aspect, the deaths. In fact, in my own life, I have seen at least 2 deaths and about 3 to 4 accidents in the construction sites where I was living, or maybe in some places where I was working. So why did this happen? Because of lack of implementation of appropriate measures and certain protocols. And again, the gender, because this is a hard work, how gender, especially the women workers, how they spend their lives, what are the constraints they have, what are the difficulties they have, because it's biologically how they are different. And especially for the pregnant women, and how it becomes difficult because there's no paid medical leaves when they are on a, when they have to deliver a baby or when they are pregnant. Obviously, certain facilities may or may not be there. So this is a very quite difficult composition. And what they get paid is very meager incomes. So you're talking about 200, 300, 400. Talks about unskilled, it's about 350, and semi-skilled 420, and 506, and about 600 it's about highly skilled. But these migrants, from where they are coming from the remote villages of maybe nearby states like Bihar, Jharkhand, UP, or any other places, and then they come for for a better living and better income, and what they end up is a kind of no space to live, and there's no toilets, no work, no water, no crèche, or so. And now if you look at the actors, if you look at the developer, so the project initiator who actually funds or who actually promotes the development, and then there's a registered building contractor, and you have the subcontractor, and then you have subcontractor, and then the Mukaddam recruits from village for on-site workers. So for example, in many of the cases, what they do is, let's say a group of 100 workers, he brings from Bihar village or some other Bengal or Orissa somewhere, and he is the leader within the group of villages, and he brings all the men for a period of 2 months or 3 months, and then they stay here and then they go back. So they are trained in that particular work, and they do that work and they go back, and that's how they keep rotating in that whole process. So obviously there's a kind of local leaders who are associated with the contractors, the subcontractors, and that is how the whole chain process works. And in terms of the social security aspect and the living conditions, especially there are 2 sides. One is the off-site provisions and the on-site provisions. In fact, if you're talking about off-site, people tend to reside under the flyovers or the pavements or the street edges, or they might just temporarily stay on a government land, or they might start a new slum altogether. Whereas in on-site, they provide a space for these construction workers, and that is how where their proximity is much reduced. But if you look at a project, a construction worker is aligned throughout the project, but how they are varied. So now there is different stages. One is the project conceptualization. The moment you are conceptualization, you know what is the magnitude of the project you are planning for, you know what is the scale of it, you know what is the duration of it. So how we can procure the land, right? It is not only the land which you are planning to build, but how you can accommodate for your construction workers. That is also an important aspect. And the design development, project funding, obtainment of approval, and then how you select the contractors, signing of contracts, selection of subcontractors, and then allocation of site, procurement of materials, and erection of structures on site. So in this, Hannah wrote from CEPT University, the way she categorized, how you actually tender a project and how you assign the projects and how you erect it. So this whole process from 0 to 0. And so how this whole process goes on, starting from the selection of contractors to the, conception of a project, to the end of the project, and to the demolition of the whole cluster. So this is a process. And if one has to understand, this is where you have to bring the project management dimension also into it. Because if you really want to work out the logistics of it, one has to understand what phase of the project, what is the duration, and what kind of skilled labor you need at that point of time. Imagine a brick masons do you need at the time of a structure, or a concrete or a shuttering guys which are needed. So when I'm talking about the construction workers, I'm talking about these people who come for, it's not about a specialized carpenters, it's not about a specialized HVAC people, but I'm talking about the casual labor who does all these masons or who was set up by this process. So, but one has to understand at a foundation level, and foundation to plinth you need a different requirement. From plinth to the structure you need a different requirement, and then the slab you need a different requirement, and then the finishing of the structures, especially the walls, walling material and everything, then the perfect finishes which comes into it, that is where you go for the plaster works and things like that. That's a different requirement. And then any kind of services, that's a different requirement. So altogether, once if you know, this is one example of in our own campus of IIT Roorkee Boys Hostel project, foundation to plinth up to G+1 slab, G+3 slab, G+5, G+6, and then you have the machine room, the finishing, and then the completion part of it. So if you look at the inflow and outflow of the, so it goes on from 360, and then it goes on to 520 at some point, and then it comes down, because the more it comes to the completion stage, obviously it comes down. So the peak point is when they are actually developing the structures and whole walling aspects. And similarly, this is how one has to relate with the project management aspect of it and the timelines into it. So that is one aspect which Venkatesh tried to look into it. And then when we are trying to address this holistic issue, which was not well addressed so far, one has to look not just only a case study or studying 2-3 units or any camps and come to a conclusion. So for that, what we did was I asked Venkatesh to, in fact the jury members also asked Venkatesh to go back and looked at the standards, the basic codes, what are our manuals talk about it. So that is where he looked at various standards like International Labour Organization, how they framed the guiding principles, housing standards, at the same time the NBC, the National Building Code, and how they talked about these aspects, the habitat selection criteria, area requirements, and construction materials and areas, and kitchen, toilets. So, and then again you have the Building and Other Construction Workers Act, which is about 1996, and that talks about the hours of work, welfare measures. So all these we do have certain international level and the national level and the local level part of it. But let's see what they are going to talk about. In fact, when we talk about habitat selection, they talk about reasonable distance. So what is reasonable? Is it 1 kilometer, 5 kilometers, 15 kilometers? What is reasonable? So these are all more of a qualitative standards. Now when we say away from electric lines, obviously how far they should be. So this is where one need a kind of indication that yes, this is, if this condition, this is what we need to do. And adequate drainage. So this is again a qualitative terms. What is adequate? How many population? How much? What kind of flow patterns we have to give, right? What kind of water storage we have to give for how many people, right? So this is all talks about the numbers, but the reality of these norms doesn't mention much about these precise figures. So as we talk about, there are few the sleeping spaces which talks about for 2 people 7.5 square meter, for 3. So basically they have given some broader area requirements, and at the same time they talk about the heights, they talk about, and again the health and safety aspect of it. So when we talk about emergency plans prepared, have you ever seen, at least in Indian scenario, how many of these constructions have they got emergency plans, how to evacuate if there is any fire or a gas blast on it, or any, and the pest control, and again some information on HIV waves. So there's all a variety aspects on health and safety, the security aspect of it, and the fire safety, the first aid. If anything happens, how are they trained into it, how they can easily cope up for the immediate relief. And similarly, they have the domestic aspects of it, the water, how much water we have. We have to talk about adequate supply of drinking water. What do you mean adequate? For how many people, how much of gallons of water to be provided? And again, the distances between the toilet and the urinary. So that is where we have to talk about sanitary aspect and the drinking potable aspect, how they have to be aligned. And again, we have the standards specifying about how many WCs per how many people, and for male and female. And again, but it doesn't talk much about the children. And whereas, again, adequate light and ventilation, how much? Because that is what the precise nature one need to come up with. And so, in fact, all these provisions, all these inferences, they talks about, they are not talking about a particular aspect in its complete form. Rather, it is open-ended and sometimes it is ambiguous. So the designer is, when he is planning for any particular project, when he is planning for even the construction work report, to the standards doesn't help him in a complete manner. And then what he did was he collected a variety of contracts both from the public and the private projects and agencies like NBCC, National Building Company Limited, and CPWD, the public agencies, and DMRCL, the Metro, and UNDP, United Nations, Municipal Corporation of Mumbai, IIT Indore, and the Griha. So a variety of contracts, and then Gammon India. So all these he have analyzed. And then the way he have analyzed was, what he did was he identified the concerned text of in the contract between the client and the contractors, what is the actual text mentioning about this construction workers housing, and then he highlighted some of the important points which talks about a pertinent issue on it, pertinent aspect. In fact, for instance, you can see where we talk about ensure that labor huts area is kept clean and ensure sanitary conditions. That talks about health and hygiene, and whereas the dismantling, which talks about inside or elsewhere, and when we talk about this is dismantling, and this is a sanitary condition. So basically, he's identifying a kind of content analysis. Through the content analysis, he identified, categorize them into codes, and then he tried to relate, what are the various emphasis which has been laid out, and that is where we get the minimum priority, where they talks about this construction material and technology, women and children, and recreation and regeneration, kitchen, cooking, accommodation. But whereas the loopholes, there are also certain loopholes which have identified, as I told to you, that what kind of precise spaces we need to give, and the typology and the areas required. Apart from this, there are also some acknowledgements on to the various research projects and some prototype developments on the same domain of construction workers housing. Renu Desai and Sachin Soni, where they talked about this housing conditions, and you can see how people dwell under the flyovers. And in the SPA Delhi, how they talked about a kind of product orientation of how we can unpack and pack the things. And similarly, Hannah Brooks' work also talks about. But most of these, they all talk about the prefab components of it, how we can easily take it out and reuse it elsewhere. So. And also, how we can reuse the waste materials as well for producing meaningful and profitable material choices. So that is where we talk about the prefabrication of viable solution. That is one way of looking at it. And at the other side of it is the tenure and the security and the affordability. So apart from these transition shelters, but there is also some permanent outcomes, where you can see from built by Costford. You can see all these in Kerala and Abu Dhabi. They built the whole society of these construction workers, the permanent housing. But one of the problem for these particular thing is, after once the area is built, how they actually travel. The commutations also becomes a problem, because they have to be there in the construction for months and months. And how, basically, if you look at it, you can see cost per laborer, it's about 750 to 1,000 per month. So basically, it's a kind of partition, contribution that how a laborer also gives for his permanent way of dwelling. So there are different models what we have discussed. And then to understand the reality, so especially some educational institutional buildings, ongoing institutional buildings, and some private universities, and as well as the private developments have been visited and have been recorded completely. With a thorough recording has been done with all the project management dimension into it, the social dimension into it, and the cultural dimension into it, and the financial dimension into it. So the various dimensions have been recorded. And for instance, if you look at a kind of comparative analysis of IIT Roorkee, IIT Ropar, IIT Kashipur, whereas the private university, the Bennett University and Blossom Greens and Maya Garden, and so it has, these two are done by the NBCC and CPWD, but this one is by the corporation, Shapoorji Pallonji company is doing, and whereas these have been doing for the same labor housing site use for multiple projects. So like that, we have got a variety of understanding of how various projects goes on. And what Venkatesh tried to do is, it's basically, he tried to bring a relationship between the camp area and the built-up area and the built-up area and how whatever we are building, and in association, what is the proportion that a construction worker's space should be attached with. So if you are talking about 10 acres, then how much it should be? Within 10 acres, if it's a built-up area of 35-40%, then how much, according to the built area compositions, how much is the proportion we can bring down to an understanding of how much construction workers area we need. So that is where you can see the camp area site. And if you look at the previous, so you have the project site area and the project built up area. So that is where you can see the FAR and all other things. So with that, if you analyze with the camp area and the camp built up area, and at the same time the built up area for dwellings and for facilities and the labor camp area, and this is where you can see the rental system here free, but here you can see they have been deducted. And then what is the capacity? So that is where the labor count. So then what he did was he actually mapped everything, all the layouts of it, and what are the activity patterns and what are the material contributions into it. So like you can see that you see a small cafe there and the material yard here and the open defecation and the common kitchens. So which means you can see the proximity, the kitchens and these open defecation are very much nearby. So that is where he mapped all the aspects of their living and how they are segregated by the division of contractor, the subcontractor's house, and as well as the local skilled labor's houses, the family dwelling units, as well as bachelor's dwelling units. And so this is how you can see there's an office here, and there is a first aid room, the materials yard, and you have the drinking water and the toilets, bathing and washing, and the common. So basically how the service areas are also categorized in every settlement. And similarly in IIT Kashipur, so recorded all the areas, calculations, number of at peak, what is the number of laborers, and then number of contractors and the number of dwelling units, and how their activity patterns are decided. And you can see here, for instance, the crèche and the material yard are very much nearby. But you look at the safety aspect of it, because the poor children will be playing there, and suddenly a lorry comes and dumps all the pebble, and so there is no barriers or nothing to protect them. So that is where one has to see, how we can give a consideration for these health and safety aspects. And the activity patterns are also important. And similarly, you can see that how the camp 1 and the incremental processes into it. So like that, he actually mapped all the spatial layouts into it. But now when I brought the project management aspect into it, you can see that when the project is progressing, the construction workers, the number of housing dwelling, they're also progressing, started with 18 dwellings, and then it goes on for 144, and then it started reducing, right? So in a span of 4 or 5 years, the count is gradually coming down, and gradually they keep on moving to other places. So like that, you have to understand at what level, what is the requirement, and how these people are migrating. And so that kind of understanding will also give, a thorough understanding what kind of spaces you need to provide, what kind of services we need to provide, and when, how much. Now when you talk about the culturally responsibility environment, that is where the ethnicity also comes into the picture. So most of these people come from nearby villages, or at least from one locality, who are hired by a local contractor. And if you look at it, you can see he mapped even the ethnic origins of the Bengal or MP. So where they tend to stay nearby places, they try to stay together And that is where a sense of community is born. But obviously, most of the difficult things in these settlements is often they get disputes from one community to another community. That is the most frequent things which they get. So you can see that how they are staying together in clusters. And similarly, I am Kashipur. Everywhere you can see people. Mostly they're coming from Bengal, Orissa, Bihar, Jharkhand, and UP, and some places they have MP also. And what are the distances they have to travel for their defecation, so their kitchen, and most of them they have a shared kitchen concept, but in reality they also set up their own kitchens outside. So also just a kind of understanding what kind of materials, like you have the tin sheets, you have the brick, sometimes you have the kind of prefab materials. So one aspect you have to understand is here you have to also think about the moment you are thinking of the site, what site you have to provide for them, where you have to, because imagine your construction, your project is in the heart of Delhi or heart of a city. Obviously it is very difficult to find a living environment for them, especially with the land price. That is where a circle rate, a valuation techniques has to be accommodated. What is the circle rate in that area and how far you can get another place for them to live, so that they don't need to travel 30 kilometers, 50 kilometers every day for their work and go back. In that case, then what kind of transportation facilities you are providing, what kind of work shifts you are providing. So that is where valuation also comes into the picture of understanding the land economics of it. And as I said, in each case, the labor count, the number of dwelling units, obviously they goes on, and the requirement goes on up and down. And there are a few mapping of inside the rooms, what kind of multiple purposes which they use. So a small room could be used for multiple, it could be a kitchen, it could be a sleeping room for many people, and the materials are also analyzed. What is the cost of these materials for setting up and as well as dismantling, as well as how much impact it will take. For instance, if you talk about the cement, it takes, the causes lung infection, and also some kind of the skin diseases. There's a lot of issues are there even with the materials. And in terms of the planning, what we did was like all the case studies, they have been brought and tried to compare with the standards. Like for instance, if you talk about average number of houses, what standards talk about, and sometimes the standard doesn't talk about it. It only qualifies it, but it doesn't quantifies it. So that is where when you talk how the existing scenario is there and how we come to the observations and how we can placement of services, water and toilets, and how about, because they vary from construction site less than 10 acres and more than 10 acres, how the different requirements are needed for a smaller construction sites and as well as bigger construction sites. So this activity, the whole activity mapping has been done from various timings, and you can see from 5 to 8, 8 to 10, and he mapped out staying with them in a participatory way, understanding what is the dynamics happening in that space, where the women were spending more time, where the men were spending, where the children were spending, and that is where he was also comparing the various material proportions, and how it will cost, and what are the cost implications, what are the impacts on health, what are the impact on design, all these aspects into it. And then again, from the contracts, from the standard, from the contracts, and then what is the kind of design inference which he is getting. So that is how the service infrastructure also has been assessed. So a comparative parameters with the standards, with the contracts, or with any particular guidelines which we have, and with the existing case studies, so that what we can infer through the design. And that is where we talk about health and safety, the security, the transport, material storage, the site office, store, market, television, recreation. So there are some other models also which we have to have a kind of the ATMs, the portable water ATMs sort of thing, the solar lighting, and the toilet systems. So all these we do have some options in the market, and how one can negotiate it with the project and how it could be that has to be worked out. And similarly, the social response, how the users are feeling about those spaces, and all the social surveys have been conducted. So after an intense survey into it, then the design strategies were developed. In fact, the design strategies were classified into 4 components. One is at a policy and compliance level, the planning and spatial level, planning and architecture level, and the operations and maintenance level, and the establishment and implementation level. So what he did was, in the policy level, he compared with he thought of addressing some changes in the standards and the contracts. And then in a planning and architectural component, starting from a range of unit design to the settlement level, and then the supervision and the signage. And here at the end, what he did was he developed a kind of mobile application. If anyone wants to refer, it's a tentative application, but anyone wants to just put in their built up area and the location and the plot area, it automatically gives you how much labor requirement is probably needed, and what kind of housing you need, and what kind of space you need. So that sort of small design manual has been produced towards the end. So these are the aspects which has been covered in the strategies. I just briefly through. And so as I said, the 3 aspects, one is the project conception and funding, award of contract itself. We have to be careful, and we have to acknowledge these construction workers, the need for their shelter and the facilities for their shelter, and the budget has to be included in that, and the agreements has to be included in that. So this is one thing which we have. And then in the spatial aspect, how we select a site. Are we going to for off-site or an on-site? If it is off-site, where and when and how we are transporting them. Then strategic planning and allocation. Are we allocating the clusters by gender or by family-wise, by bachelors, by ethnicity? And then the provision of services, how far the distances are, setting up the units and additional services and provisions. At the same time, it's not only the provisions, how they maintain a culture of safety, how we inspect and organize and the last one is dismantle, the creation to the taking it out from the site, and how we can reuse it, because that is where the business aspect of it. So when we talk about the standards, the size of the site, the material, the transportation options, the planning patterns, lighting level, all these things has to be relooked into it. And Venkatesh tried to, and in the contracts also, we should also talk about the demolition of it, and the parking aspect and material. So when we talk about, again, the site selection, as I said, on-site or off-site, the cost of rent, the proximity, all these things has to be calculated. And what are the facilities you have? And if it is less than 10 acre, the whole dynamics is different. If it is more than 10 acre, then the setbacks and everything will vary at all. Similarly, the built up area required, if it is 70 to 75%, whereas it is 25 to 30%. So that makes a huge difference. And the landscape, how we can actually consume the existing landscape, and how we can plan accordingly so that it can provide a natural shade. And number of dwellings, we are taking about 5 dwellings, and how clusters could be organized and how services could be distributed has been also thought about it. And whether we can go for a dual story or a single story, if it is more than less than 10 acre, because the size constraint is less, but whereas in more than 10 acres, you have a provisions of having an incremental development, and that is where there's the option of second floor could go. There's the phasing out plan, and at the same time, the ethnicity, the single person, the family, supervisor. Some people work in a night shift and day shift, how the dwellings has to be organized. Because when the moment the man is leaving their family and kids in the night shift, obviously, how you can place their dwellings, So ethnic groups, and what are the various space saving techniques you can think of, and what kind of barriers we can keep for the health and safety aspects. So all these have been laid out, and basically from a single user point of view, and the family point of view, and the supervisor point of view. And again, it talks about the distances, and at the same time, it talks about, these are a very, I would say, kind of at an initial level from whatever Venkatesh have studied. But these things could be further elaborated, and these could be further evaluated and to make into a concrete suggestions to both the policy and as well as the practice. So you can talk about the materials and how a small conceptual layouts could be laid out, what amount of storage we need to give for them, for each laborer, and the cooking spaces we should give, and the materials which we can give, and even a gunny sack with a lime plaster, a small indigenous ideas of how we can give a kind of permanent settings. And at the same time, how many occupants in one cluster and what are the role ends. All these are basically what kind of recreational spaces we need to, how we need to provide them, how we can clusterize that. So the storage cabinets, and the service and infrastructure, both for 10 acres and less than 10 acres and more than 10 acres, pest control, operations, first aid kit. So this is just a very introductory part of the design strategies, but what one can understand from this study is the way how different dimensions play an important role. One is the project management dimension, one is the land economics, the valuation dimension, one is the social dimension, the ethnic dimension into it, and the way the whole the policy level, how the contracts and how the standards they talk, the legal dimension into it, and there's the medical dimension into it. There's a variety of dimensions come together. One has to. So that is what we say. This is only an academic work. It just showed a way and different dimensions that are to be addressed to understand the construction worker shelter context. Hence, this work is to be treated as starting point, and it could be further developed to inform the strategic directions in policy and practice. Thank you.